Please subscribe to hear more Cryptid Tales. If you like the story you heard, give us a thumbs up and feel free to leave us a comment. If you'd like to hear your own cryptid encounter on Cryptid Tales, send us an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com.
What's funny is, this happened so far back ago, and because of time and a promise, I had forgotten it. The year was 1974, or 75, and I was 6 or 7 years old at the time. I know most people don't remember things that happened that far back, but thanks to brain surgery, many memories have come flooding back to me. 95% of them have been verified by older family members. This happened in East Texas, in what was then a small town called Livingston. It's now a small city, with a population of 5,500. My aunt and uncle had decided to try their hands at the farm life. Livingston is set right at the easternmost part of the Sam Houston National Forest, right next to the Lone Star Trail, about 70 miles northeast from its much bigger neighbor of Houston. My aunt and uncle were from Houston. My aunt, who was a native Texan, had kinfolk out in Livingston, who had 10 acres of land about 10 miles outside the city proper. The land was set right in a huge holler, surrounded by the big thicket forest that stretches all the way to the east coast. My parents and I lived in Conroe, which is about 40 miles west from Livingston. My parents had decided that they would take us kids, my sister and I, up to Livingston to stay for a weekend of true country living. My aunt and uncle had chickens, goats and pigs, that they were raising, and the neighboring acreage, my aunt's kin, had cows they grazed on the land. On previous visits, we had seen raccoons, armadillos, possums, and even coyotes. It was awesome as a kid hearing them roam the woods howling as they hunted up prey. It was Saturday morning, and from what I do remember of the occurrence, the women, my aunt and mom, had loaded up and headed into town. They were going grocery shopping and planning to hit a couple of farmer stands that sold fresh vegetables along the way. They had left behind my sister, who was 4 or 5, my cousin, who was 5, and I, who was 6 or 7, with our fathers. The men were keeping busy outside between working on my uncle's truck and castrating a couple of pigs. My dad and uncle were from Washington State and had been raised on a farm, so this was old fun for them, being that they had been working in the city for the last years and been gone from the farm life for quite some time. That morning, we kids were inside playing and watching good old Saturday morning cartoons, being loud and having a blast as out here where there was no one to bother. My aunt and uncle lived in an old 2-bedroom, pier and beam house. My cousin all of a sudden came screaming out of the hallway bathroom. She was screaming that a bear had looked into the bathroom window at her. Of course, I went flying into the bathroom to take a look at this bear. I was the only boy out of the cousins, and I was absolutely fearless. When I got into the bathroom, there was nothing there. Back then, there was no central air in the old houses, and you kept the windows open to air out the house. Being only 6 years old, I couldn't see out the window and had to crawl up onto the toilet to peek out the window. To my amazement, I was not looking at a bear, but a huge woman. She had already moved away from the side of the house and was getting ready to enter the tree line, which was about 40 feet from the house. As I craned my head out the window to gaze at her, she stopped walking and turned towards me. I remember she turned at the waist, not the neck, which seemed strange, I guess, but that was how I was able to notice she was a woman. She had breasts. She was covered in black hair, but not like a bear, because you could see her skin underneath, whereas bears you can't. As I looked her up and down, which the whole event took probably 20 seconds, she smiled. I say this because in the eyes of a 6-year-old kid, it seemed a smile. Her lips just curved up. She didn't show any teeth. I do remember, and it seems to stick out to me that she had what I say were the saddest eyes I had ever seen. I had been paying attention so closely to her that I didn't even notice that the men had come running into the house hearing the girls raising such a ruckus. My father came striding into the bathroom and asked me what I saw, as he saddled up to the window beside me. I'd turned away to look at him when he came in, and when I turned back, she was gone. My dad asked me, what was it? Was it a bear? I told him, no, Dad, it wasn't. He said, but it was looking in the window, right? The window was set probably 6 foot off the ground outside, so that's why he assumed it had to be a bear. I told him, no, Dad, it wasn't a bear. It was a big, hairy woman. She had boobs, Dad. After 10 seconds of us trying to find it looking through the window, I remember him bolting out of the bathroom and meeting my uncle in the living room. They went to my uncle's room and came out with shotguns. They told us kids to stay inside the house. They went out there with their guns, and we watched them through the windows as they circled the house, meeting around the back. They would stand outside for a while talking. Then my dad came in, took me back into the bathroom, shut the door and asked, was I sure it wasn't a bear? I told him it wasn't. Then he told me that we didn't want to scare the girls and the women, so we were going to tell them it was a bear. My dad and uncle had fully expected to see a bear out here in these parts and knew that black bears, for the most part, were harmless, as long as you didn't surprise one with cubs. What I wouldn't realize until much later in life was that my dad and uncle were from Washington State and used to hunt around Mount St. Helen. They had camped around its notorious Spirit Lake, where you camped out there to hear the screaming all night from the other side of the lake. That weekend, at my aunt and uncle's, would be quite exciting as listen to the screaming echoing across the holler. We were told by our dads that it was a cougar in heat or wildcats, which because of how old we were, we didn't question. If that's what our dad said, then that's what it was. We would go home that Sunday evening, having enjoyed our weekend out in the country. My aunt and uncle, months later, would move back to Houston, as my uncle got a very nice job in town. Now, I've always been obsessed, my family's words, with Bigfoot. Always believed in them. In 2016, I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma of the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that controls memory, sleep, and your subconscious. That year, they would remove a golf ball-sized soft tumor from my brain. It had been causing blackouts, memory loss, and some odd behavior over the last few years. We would come to find out later. It wouldn't be until 2018, after recovering from the surgery and the chemotherapy, sitting around my mother's kitchen having breakfast with my sister and my mom. In conversation, we happened to mention my aunt and uncle's farm back then. A rush of memories flooded my mind, all the good things we saw and did, and I mentioned the bear. My mom and sister looked at me questioningly. My mom finally said that she remembered something about that. My sister said that she had no recollection at all of the farm at all. As I was playing the memory through my head, it wouldn't be until I was peeking through the window that I saw the Sasquatch. I almost became dizzy when it came back to me. I had blocked the memory out because of not only the tumor in my skull, but the actual Sasquatch sighting because of the promise a 6-year-old boy had made to his father. Months later, after that breakfast, I would tell my mother about this promise. My father passed away 14 years ago, and my mother loves to hear any memory that is shared about the long-lost love of her life. After I finished telling her the story, I expected for her to look at me like I was crazy, but she was crying. She said that it explains everything, my obsession, my belief in something that isn't supposed to exist. And it was exactly something my father would do. The women don't need to know anything about this. They must be protected at all costs. That's just how my dad was.